This talk is titled Links Between Bowen Theory and Evolutionary Theory. Murray Bowen wrote that he fashioned a natural systems theory, quote, designed to fit precisely with principles of evolution and the human as an evolutionary being. He also wrote that he viewed man, quote, as an evolutionary assemblage of cells who has arrived at his present state from hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary adaptation and maladaptation, and who is evolving on to other changes. In this sense, wrote Bowen, man is related directly to all living matter. Now, in choosing theoretical concepts, an attempt was made by Bowen to keep them in harmony with man as a protoplasmic being. From these and many other statements, it's clear that Bowen attempted to construct a theory of human behavior that was grounded in evolution and evolutionary theory. However, Dr. Bowen did not always make clear how the concepts in the theory he developed specifically connect to evolutionary thinking. Moreover, evolutionary theory has not stayed static since Darwin published his theory of evolution. So given the importance of evolution in Bowen's development of family systems theory, how do important concepts and variables of the theory link to evolution and the ongoing developments in evolutionary theory? This presentation will endeavor to define more clearly some conceptual links between Bowen theory and evolutionary theory. Progress in science consists principally in the progress of scientific concepts, according to Ernst Mayr, a renowned evolutionary biologist. Mayr wrote, quote, the contribution made by new concepts or by the more or less radical transformation of old concepts is equally and often more important than facts and their discovery. Those are not far wrong, he wrote, who insist that the progress of science consists principally in the progress of scientific concepts, unquote. A concept is an idea that serves to gather a number of particular observations into a more general formulation. A scientific concept is one that grounds the more general idea in verifiable facts. The conceptual link is the ability to demonstrate the connection between two sets of observable facts. So a pattern of functioning in the human may resemble in specific ways a similar pattern of functioning in other forms of life. For example, one of the two main variables of Bowen theory is anxiety. Bowen defined anxiety as an emotional response to a real or perceived threat. An emotion, in Bowen theory, refers to an intimate part of the human's phylogenetic past which we share with lower forms of life, which are governed by the same laws that govern all living things. All living things have ways of perceiving threat and taking defensive or evasive action in response. So the variable of anxiety connects the human to other forms of life, in that other forms of life also have ways of detecting and responding to threat, or the perception of threat. The concept of anxiety, as Bowen defined it, is present throughout life. Anxiety then would seem to qualify as one conceptual link that Bowen theory makes between the human and all other forms of life. So concepts are important to the development of science. The concept of the family as an emotional unit became one of Bowen's most important concepts. As a result of watching members of families with a young adult schizophrenic over a 5-year period at the National Institute of Mental Health, he moved from focusing on individuals to focusing on the patterns of how family members related to one another over time and under a variety of conditions. He observed the way in which anxiety got transferred from one family member to another, and from one relationship to another. He observed people functioning as if they were one organism, with little ability to alter automatic ways of reacting to one another. He said he shifted from seeing schizophrenia as, quote, a process between mother and patient, or an illness in the patient influenced by the mother, to an orientation of schizophrenia as a distraught family that becomes focused on one individual, unquote. The concept of the family as an emotional unit is what enabled Bowen to work toward defining variables that influence the intensity with which family members functioned in relation to one another. In time, he found that these same patterns that were present in an intense and fixed fashion in the families in the NIMH project could also be discerned in families with less intense problems, and even in families without diagnosable symptoms. Patterns observed in the families in the NIMH project light up in any family under enough pressure. So the ability to see the family as a unit enabled Bowen to define the specific concepts of the theory that, taken together, became a comprehensive theory of the family as an emotional system. The concept of the family as an emotional system still stands in stark contrast to the conventional focus on the individual in mental health, medicine, law, and religion. Evolutionary theory includes a concept of the family as a unit, or the community, or the group, on which natural selection can act. As evolutionary thinking has developed over the years, the concept of how the family as a unit contributes to the evolution of life has also changed. Darwin suggested that natural selection can act at the level of the family or community, as well as at the level of the individual. Natural selection can even generate sterile individuals in a species if the sterile individuals enhance the welfare of the group and the community's fertile members flourish. Selection is not so much for the modified sterile individual as for the community's capacity to generate them. As the science of genetics developed, theories of evolution begin to stress the importance of each individual organism getting its genes into the next generation, even if that individual, him or herself, didn't mate and transmit its genes to the next generation. So that would be the idea of close kin surviving can mitigate the loss of genes of the non-productive individuals getting into the next generation, because genes similar to that individual's own are still getting into the next generation. Survival of genes similar to one's own through the offspring of close kin is more critical than the survival of one's own offspring. Bowen family theorists have pondered how it is that the potential for schizophrenia has not been eliminated from the human gene pool, since people diagnosed as schizophrenics are far less likely to marry and reproduce. If the family is viewed as the unit of selection, then schizophrenia may have a function that enhances the reproductive success of other members of the same family. Bowen theory endeavors to describe how a family system functions, while evolutionary theory attempts to account for how a system evolves. But how a system functions may well contribute to a better understanding of how the unit evolves. Evolutionary theorists have formulated their own versions of a concept of the family as a unit on which natural selection acts. Defined organisms of the same, or different organisms of the same species vary in their ability to survive and reproduce in spite of threats to their well-being and to their survival. Bowen theory includes a set of concepts that account for variation in functioning across multiple generations of human families. The central concept of differentiation of self describes variation in the ability of individuals and families to adapt to challenges. Better differentiated people are better able to maintain a more objective thinking process, even under pressure, and better able to maintain a separate self in close relationships. The behaviors of less well-differentiated people are driven more by an intense subjective feeling process, and they are more vulnerable to losing self in close relationships. Children in the same family can grow up with different levels of differentiation, depending on the intensity of parental anxiety transmitted to the child. As parents reproduce, they may have at least one child with a slightly lower level of differentiation than their own level, another child with a slightly higher level of differentiation, and still others emerge as adults with about the same level of differentiation as their parents. Over multiple generations, wrote Bowen, quote, a segment of the downward group produces descendants who do poorly in their life courses and who are vulnerable to emotional, physical, and social illnesses. At the same time, the upward group produces descendants with successful life courses. The process is constant in all humans as it is played out in each new generation of children. The same pattern, Bowen wrote, is in evolution, as some life forms are more successful and others proceed toward extinction. Here, the concepts of the multi-generational transmission of varying levels of differentiation through the family projection process links conceptually with the descent with modification idea in Darwin's theory. This set of concepts in Bowen theory can help to account for variation in adaptive functioning across multiple generations of human families. The developing field of epigenetics describes the way in which specific environmental conditions can affect the expression of genes. When the family is understood as a really important part of a child's environment, the way the family functions in one generation can influence the expression of genes in the next. Michael Meany's classic study of variation in licking and grooming by rat mothers of their offspring demonstrated that this can affect the stress reactivity of their pups in adulthood. Offspring of high licking and grooming mothers showed more modest behavioral and endocrine responses to stress compared to animals reared by low-licking and grooming mothers. Rats raised by low-licking and grooming mothers had high HPA responses to stress. Meany described in detail how variation in this licking and grooming behavior on the part of the mother can alter the extra and intracellular environment of neurons in selected brain regions. Such alternations directly modify the epigenetic marks in regions of DNA that regulate the transcriptions of glucocorticoid receptors, which in turn regulate the HPA response to stress. These changes in epigenetic marks get transmitted from one generation to the next. Variation in the intensity of the family projection process in human families stands out as a possible variable influencing the expression of genes associated with stress reactivity in children. In the late 1970s, Dr. Bowen described the multi-generational process of transmitting lower and higher levels of differentiation as following a genetic-like pattern which had nothing to to do with genes as they were currently defined. The possibility that an intense family projection process can modify epigenetic markers for stress reactivity in children suggests that the concept of the multi-generational transmission process may provide a link to variation in the adaptability of children. Perhaps we need a new concept of the family epigenome to account for ways in which family interaction can create variation in stress reactivity among members of the same family. Additional concepts have emerged in evolutionary theory as new knowledge has become available. The synthesis of Darwin's theory with genetics led to the idea that random genetic mutation is the source of novelty in evolution and eventually contributes to the emergence of new species. Darwin had the idea that evolution was a slow and gradual process and that slight variations gradually evolved into new species through natural selection, preserving changes that were more adaptive. Neo-Darwinism added that the random mutation of genes acted on by natural selection is what gradually leads to speciation. The problem with this view is that the fossil record does not support it. Typically, there are long periods of stasis in the fossil record, followed by the relative sudden emergence of new species. When the natural environment suddenly changes, waiting for a random mutation that will specifically help an organism adapt in just the right way to the rapidly changing environment appears questionable. Stephen Gould's concept of punctuated equilibrium fits the fossil record, but raises questions about whether random genetic mutation is sufficient to generate the novelty out of which new species evolve. Evolutionists like Lynn Margulis suggest that symbiosis is the central force behind the evolution of new species. Symbiosis is an ecological phenomenon where one kind of organism lives in physical contact with another. Long-term living together leads to a symbiosis and new intracellular structures, new organs and organ systems, and new species even, as one being incorporates another that's already good at something else. Big leaps forward result from mergers between different kinds of organisms, a process Margulis calls symbiogenesis. Sense organs of vertebrates, for example, have modified cilia. Sensory cilia did not come, she argues, from random mutations. They came from acquiring a whole genome of a symbiotic bacterium that could already sense light or motion. Jan Sapp argues every gene is an historical product, and like the cell, is the result of ancient symbioses and horizontal gene transfers. Nearly 50% of the human genome consists of transposable DNA sequences acquired exogenously, according to Sapp. Well, Bowen theory includes two counterbalancing life forces. One, a life force for individuality, which he defines as the need we have to be a productive, autonomous individual as defined by the self rather than the dictates of the group. The other life force he calls the life force for togetherness, which is the universal need for emotional closeness, love, approval, and agreement. Bowen considered these two life forces as part of the emotional system, part of the human we share with all of life. These life forces are part of the emotional system. They go back to the earliest forms of life, when individual one-celled forms of life came together to form multicellular organisms. The quote, individuality of the single cell is modified by its relationship to the other cells in the multicellular organism. The multicellular organism is more complex, with new ways to adapt to its environment. Even in terms of embryonic development, you can see a process of individuality and togetherness playing out. An immature stem cell in a developing embryo is an example of this interplay between the individuality force and the togetherness force in nature. The individual cell in a developing embryo is influenced by the signals it receives from other cells around it to become the kind of cell that fits for the part of the growing embryo in which it finds itself. The force to be an individual is counterbalanced by the forces for togetherness that exert influence on the cell to become the kind of cell that can function as a viable part of a larger unit. The concept of counterbalancing forces is something that Bowen observed play out in family interaction. But a version of the process can be said to occur up and down the phylogenetic scale, going all the way back to the earliest forms of life. In this sense, the concept of counterbalancing life forces of individuality and togetherness provide another way to consider the process of symbiosis. The very idea of the family as a system provides another potential link between Bowen theory and newer developments in evolutionary thinking. James Shapiro, a molecular biologist at the University of Chicago, has proposed the concept of natural genetic engineering to describe the capacity of a cell to re-engineer its own DNA in response to threats to the ability of the organism to survive, grow, and proliferate. He writes such challenges are most likely to occur at times of major ecological disruption. He goes on to write about this being a major conceptual change from thinking about gradual selection of localized random changes to sudden restructuring of the genome. Natural genetic engineering, he says, replaces the, quote, invisible hands of geological time and natural selection with cognitive networks and cells that can modify their functioning in response to environmental challenge. The emphasis is systemic rather than atomistic and information-based rather than occurring by chance. So he talks about a kind of considered purposeful intervention or reorganization that can take place at the level of the genome under certain conditions. Bowen wrote that the family itself is a system, and that a change in one part of the system is followed by change in other parts of the system. Bowen wrote he prefers to think of the family as a variety of systems and subsystems. The function of any system is dependent on the larger systems of which it is a part, but also on its subsystems. The concept of systems thinking has the potential to provide the intellectual scaffolding to organize facts about how reciprocal changes in our environmental habitat affect how families function, which in turn can influence the physiology of individuals and families, which in turn can affect how networks of genes get expressed and transmit from one generation to the next. Bowen theory is a natural systems theory that is broad enough to link facts about the family as an emotional system to evolution and the human as an evolutionary being. Thanks.
Well, we are lucky to have time again to really put some brains and to work and the kinds of things that have been running through your thinking while you listen to the speakers and what things they've had. Let me see first if either of you would like to speak to have questions. So, Leanne, do you have anything that you would like to address?
I was just going to say, I just saw actually the parallels in the two talks, and I made a list of 7 things, which I won't go through the whole thing. But I thought it was a really nice example of all of life as systems, and they're deeply layered. I thought that talking about the human family as an emotional unit, I think an ant colony is an emotional unit. There are a number of parallels. Ant colonies vary in their reactivity to one another. When you shift one part of an ant colony, the other part shifts in response. There's a third of all ant colonies in harvester ants do nothing. Deborah Gordon thinks that this has to do with the absorption of reactivity in the unit. The human family, there are segments of the family that absorb the reactivity in the unit depending on the level of differentiation. She and I are constantly talking back and forth, and one of the things I was thinking about is just the challenge of talking past one another when you're from different fields. And I know when she and I first started to talk, I translated what she said into what I know, and she translated what I said and what she knows, and it was like this. But now it only took a dozen years. We kind of talk to each other. We do a lot of talking about the individual and the unit, the individual and the unit, and the importance of thinking in that way. And Randy was talking about that. Talked about rapidly changing conditions, talked about epigenetics. Epigenetics are huge. Ants are very plastic. They're constantly shifting, moving. That's an important thing that is going to be looked into in the study of these ants in the future. I'll stop for the moment.
I neglected to ask Dr. Connor if he would you be able to join the speakers and the conversation? That would be great. So we've got 2 sentences from Ms. Howard here. So anyhow, what observations that you've made? And so would you, I don't know, Reverend Frost, would you like to bring a question or observation, comments?
Yeah. I was just struck by the way in which Leanne, Ms. Howard moved almost seamlessly between different natural systems, from the natural system of the family to the harvester ants to human society as a natural system, and that some of the same principles and patterns in each inform the others. I was appreciated her emphasis on Bowen's notion of responsibility for self in a time of increasing polarization, and that becomes even more important. Remember a time, I guess it was in the late mid 70s, when inflation was a real problem, and people were talking about it. It was hitting close to 12, 13, 14%. And Bowen made a point of not changing his fees in response to the inflationary pressures in society. And I thought that was an example of one person taking a principled action on a large societal problem. And I heard several of the examples that you gave of the land and the company as examples of what one person can do. And that's really the essence of differentiation of self, which is one person striving to be a more principled and thoughtful human being while actively relating to others in their spheres where they can. So I do think these two went together.
We didn't plan this, I promise you.
You had a good basis to start from, I'd say. Okay, yes. Any thoughts from you?
Yeah,
please?
so I love hearing about comparative studies, and you both vividly described a variety of them. Somebody said yesterday that the older Dr. Bowen said, "Listen to the rats." I don't remember who that was, but you're listening to the rats and the ants, and that's great. And the Michael Meany experiments are very important, and the harvester ants are a beautiful system. And that's been very well studied by Dr. Gordon at this point. So I just have my question that I've put to a lot of people that I've met, which I'm sure you can answer, which is, how does this help me help my clients? If a young Bowen therapist is just out of training, comes up to you and says, "How does this help me help my clients?" What do you say?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it's very useful to think from an evolutionary perspective that when people come into my office, there's usually a lot of symptoms and things aren't going well. They're not coming, for a manicure. They're coming because their marriage is breaking up or someone has died, and that I've come to believe change is very slow, and I think I'm more neutral. So I think with this I ask better questions, and people make more headway talking to me than they did 30 years ago. So it's not a very good answer, but that's the one I'm thinking
So it's
of.
something that's in your mind. It's not something that was discussed
In what? I definitely don't see harvester ants in my practice.
No.
If I do, lock me up.
Mention the harvester ants to your clients.
Sometimes some people will say, "Oh, you think I'm like an ant?" And sometimes I do, but usually not in the beginning. I think I have just a different. I think I'm different as a result of studying in this way over a long period of time, and so I think the people I see recognize that somehow, and they gain something from the questions that get them to thinking a little differently. So that's
Yeah. I think understanding that the patterns of functioning that and the concepts and variables that Bowen developed that are rooted in evolution contributes to giving me a sense of what I'm up against in my own family and what clinical families are up against, and contributes to a certain patience with myself and with families I see. And it also contributes to a kind of genuine research attitude with the family, where I'm not trying to fix them or change them. I'm trying to understand these processes. And then the more family members begin to be able to observe them, recognize how difficult it is to change reactive patterns they have with the people most important to them, gradually they begin to figure out how to begin to do that. So I think it does contribute both something to me as I think about how I'm trying to manage myself with the family, but insofar as that gets conveyed either explicitly or implicitly, it helps families
answer it if someone asked me what the impact of being 2 years with Bushman was, or what 2 years in clinical years of medical school. For that matter, my wife's cancer. I would find it very hard to specify how those experiences changed me and that knowledge changed me, but it sure did, each one of those a lot. And I would say that when I teach and write and counsel students, those things are operating on my mind and heart somehow.
Well, we have some time, I know, but I hope you will all three chime in when there's something. But are there people who would like to get to the microphone and have some time to speak to this
I
fine
think
bunch?
the idea of the human as part of all life, one of the early and really valuable revelations for me with learning from Dr. Bowen was the idea of emotional neutrality. I don't think we've used that language here in this meeting too much, but emotional neutrality was such a key thing. And I remember at a conference, there was a videotape being shown of a family, and clinicians in the audience were pointing out different possible diagnoses for family members. And I remember at one point then Murray Bowen said, "I don't deal with pathology except in myself." And that just, it was that one statement that just was quite stunning to me. And I began to have this sort of the view of the mountaintop, that could you get to the point where you could be in your own family and be less blaming and a little more neutral to what you're experiencing. And the human as part of all life is so much, Michael Kerr writes about where each person is just a link in a long multi-generational process. And so each person within that has limited emotional autonomy. We are really so constrained within the pressures of being a small part of these larger systems. And that, so both of these presentations just really stirred my memories of all that. And the idea of emotional neutrality is a key part of what you try to cultivate as a clinician. That what people are up against, as you said, Randy, is such a, it just changes the way you relate to clients and to your own family. That's not really a question, but just a thought that came to me.
Do you have anything you'd like to add? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for putting it that way. One of the thoughts that came to mind as you were talking was this idea of thinking of being a part of all of life is that none of us is at the center of the universe, and we're not that important. But I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but just in a way that, I'm not at the center of the universe. I'm a little speck doing the best I can every day. And I do think an evolutionary perspective, the Bowen theory helps to bring that home. And the ants have helped a lot, too. So.
I think the idea of emotional neutrality is a real important one. And I think also that the ability to do that is enhanced by moving from an individual model where the focus is on the problem in the individual to recognizing that it's patterns of interaction that are driving the disproportionate absorption of anxiety by one member of the family or a problematic relationship. So the ability to relate to every member of the family without even internally taking sides, helps to keep the focus on the patterns of relating rather than, what's wrong with this individual. So thanks for that addition.
I'd like to put my 2 cents in, and what has really come through to me in these 2 days are the examples of people's lives and studies that are demonstrating that having a bigger view allows you to see more and to be less attached to your view. And that has really been important.
I'd like to sort of make some really brief comments and open up the dialogue to the three of you and maybe other people in the audience. And I'd like to start off and say, Dr. Connor, I really appreciated your long-term evolutionary view and the idea that I appreciate that hope is present, that there is a way evolutionary to think about it. And I'd like to reflect a little bit on Murray Bowen and his concept that has been called societal regression and societal emotional process. And as I learned from him and as I thought about it, his focus was on the family emotional unit and the way it functions and looking at the way society functioned in a similar fashion. It's brilliant. And he thought about what might trigger a societal level anxiety, and he came out with some ideas and thoughts. And he said to me, I don't have time to do this. Other people know more in terms of thinking about what might trigger, a societal level anxiety that families would respond to, and you get this reciprocity. So, I'd like to ask all of you to sort of think about what is the societal emotional process and what is regression, societal regression. I hear many people trying to decide whether we're in a regression or not. And maybe a way to think about it is process is equally important. It gives you a way of broadening your thinking. At least these are the thoughts going through me, and would like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, as I understand the concept, as with families, chronic sustained anxiety results in more emotionally determined decisions that, if it's a regression, begin to be evident in the kinds of decisions people in leadership positions make in society that are more governed by feelings, less governed by principle, less reality-oriented in terms of fact. I mean, the harvester ants have a point that when they're in better attunement with the reality of their context, they make better decisions, or which improves their survival. So the question is society more chronically anxious? Is it a process that's been going on for decades? And can we see evidence of erosion of principled leadership and functioning? And I think if the answer to that is yes, then we're in a process of regression.
Well, I for some reason, I went to a place that doesn't totally answer the question. I think process is everything in the family and society and in nature. And I think about it in terms of psychosis, that a person can come into my office and be psychotic, but that person can also calm down if their family can begin to think about it a little differently. So psychosis is definitely regression, but regression can come and regression can settle down. And depending on who a person chooses to see in a clinical practice, that may make a difference in whether that, quote, regression gets fixed or settles back down to a steady state. And what that has to do with societal regression, I'm not exactly sure. I do tend to think we are in a regression in the sense that there's a lot of, the reactivity is absolutely palatable right now. And but I believe that the process can move in it. Like psychosis, it can move differently. And that's where I thought about, where is it important to have firm, where are the places to take absolutely firm places of conviction. This is where I stand. I don't care what you think. I will not move no matter what. No. That's important. And it's going to be important in society moving forward, I believe. I'll stop.
Next, Dr.
So-
Sorry.
I'm not,
my
obviously not a family therapist, but it seems to me that if America were a family, I would think that over the last year and a half it's been in regression, and I would say that before knowing who was going to win the election, and tremendous amount of I don't know when you don't call it differentiation when somebody is only thinking about themselves, I suppose, and not listening to the other. But that's what I saw happening at a national level, and people talk about how it divided families at Thanksgiving and how it ruined Thanksgiving dinners, or families had to come up with rules about what you were allowed to say and what you were not allowed to say. I understand that the amount of marital conflict increased. I mean, forget about which side you're on. It has been a very divisive and I would think, by analogy to family, a dysfunctional and regressive period, with people talking past each other and not listening and not empathizing or sympathizing with the other members of the American family, and not really even trying that hard to get back to a functional place, just trying to win.
You next here, Dr. Paparos, I think. I think we are okay till 12:30.
Okay. Well, I have sat through these day and a half, and I very rarely speak in conferences this way because I never can formulate questions. I have thoughts that go in dialogues in my head, and questions don't come up. But I do have a thought on the regression question, and my own view is very clear on this. It is a regression in the effectiveness and efficiency of the processes that underlie the response to challenge that is at the heart of a regression, which is essentially what you just said. That those wax and wane in response to levels of tension plus the consequences of maladaptation that pile up. And that
You said the beginning part of your statement again, Dan, I think was very important.
I don't know that I can. I have a dilemma that I can't repeat what I just said, and I don't mean that to be cute, but what I'm getting at here is that it's very clear when one looks at human families that there is variation in the response patterns of the family unit to challenge, and that one can literally observe that which represents effective and efficient response to challenge. And I could go through and mark those processes. It's very clear what they are. And a movement away from them, which is a movement toward, I suppose, dysfunctional adaptation. And they begin to erode. And families vary in the quality of those adaptive and efficient responses at the point of challenge. That quality depends upon what's happened previously, what they carry forward from that, both in terms of enhanced efficiency and effectiveness and decreased efficiency and effectiveness, plus the strain on the unit that has been engendered by the consequences of those adaptations across time, which is another way of saying the consequences of the short-term response, which leads to a greater problem long-term. And those are the things that go backward and forward, I believe, socially, that constitute a regression, and I would certainly agree with you. From that point of view, we have been in a regression for a very long time, perhaps 30 or 40 years even, in slow steps as the processes become less efficient and less effective in meeting the challenges we face. I didn't want to get off on that one, but I wanted to come off to another thing I was thinking about. Many years ago, I sat in a panel just like that, and Dr. Bowen was at that end, and I was about, I don't know where either Randy or Leanne was, and Franz Duvall was sitting on the other side of me. And Dr. Bowen had gone on for a long time about differentiation of stuff, and Franz was sort of sitting there, and he wasn't quite buying all of this, and he sort of mutters under his breath into my ear, "The chimpanzee does what the chimpanzee must." And the challenge in that one is, what is your evidence that the human can do anything other than that? And that is the argument for differentiation, that the human is capable, to some degree, of regulating the must that is evolutionary programming in all of us. And it's just Franz Duvall is such a brilliant guy, and it's just such an interesting thing to think about, this sort of thing. Let me stop. I get off in my own psychosis.
Thank you. You have thoughts? You want to spit back that way? Send back.
I was just going to say that what Franz said about chimpanzees, I think applies to chimpanzees more accurately than it applies to us. That's how I would think about it. Maybe what we must do as a result of our evolution is differentiate more than the chimpanzee can, but that's pretty good if we could do it.
We have one more. I think we have time for one more, so.
Yes, I just wanted to add to the discussion, again, going back to the presentation that I gave yesterday, where I talked about the societal soil responses, and it is a reciprocal process, I believe, in terms of the soil, how the soil behaves in the face of the human activity is a response, and it very much depends upon the intensity, I believe, of the actions. And when the soil responds, if we only thought about the soil as responding, I think it could lead to insights as to how the human might be able to better govern that relationship in terms of its own contribution. The same, I was thinking then about the soil that gets washed into the rivers and the bays, and especially the Chesapeake Bay where I live. And there, what you have are the soil, certain of the nutrients are carried in, and they are excessive, and the water responds, and the plants, for instance, that are part of the ecosystem responds by being suffocated. And this then begins to affect the marine life on which humans depend for sustenance. And so if we thought about those in terms of a dynamical relationship, which I believe Bowen is describing in the regression hypothesis, that the human's response, societal's response, really could be different.
Any thoughts? Here, we've got a couple of minutes.
Well, I think it picks up, for me, it picks up the idea of, I think the one you talked about yesterday and I was mentioning today, that there's a reciprocal relationship between organism and environment, and we modify our environment, but how we modify our environment comes back on us, and then we have to adapt to what we've modified. And we've done a lot of things with the soil. Oh, you can't hear me? Oh, well, never mind. I don't know. We're ready for dinner. Okay, what I started, thank you, okay. What I started to say was, he spoke about it yesterday, I spoke about it today, that there's a reciprocity between organism and environment, and that the organisms modify their environment and then they have to adapt to what they've modified. The human, we modify our environment and we have to adapt to what we've done. So if we take down all the trees, we're going to have to adapt to what we've done. If we plant a lot of trees, that's going to be a different kind of situation, and that reciprocity is always there.
That's a great way to end, and that's part of the 2 days, I think, the reciprocity. That's wonderful. Thank you all.